Welcome to Everyday Martial Artist, a weekly podcast where you'll join me, Brian Doucette, as I interview a different martial artist each episode and hear their story. Some guests you may have heard of, and some you probably haven't. Be sure to subscribe where all your favorite podcasts are available. Also visit our website at everydaymartialartist.com. If you're listening for a specific interview, I sure hope you'll stay and check out the other episodes. A very special thank you to Topher Williams for our custom theme music. And now, the newest episode of Everyday Martial Artist. Everyday Martial Artist is brought to you by KOOnline.com for all your martial arts needs. Sparring and safety gear, rank belts, uniforms, weapons, patches, and more. Wholesale supplies made by martial artists for martial artists. Visit us today at KO-online.com. Hello and welcome to the inaugural episode of Everyday Martial Artist. I'm your host, Brian Doucette, and as many of you know, if any of you ever listen to podcasts, a lot of times when a podcast starts, it takes a while to get picked up by a lot of the podcast apps and platforms, so a lot of people put out kind of an intro episode, and I was kind of tossing around the idea and what I wanted to do for an intro episode, and I decided that I'd kind of flip the page a little bit and actually bring in a good friend of mine to interview me on the first episode so you can kind of know a little bit about my background and what the heck gives me the right to host this podcast and talk about martial arts. So I'm going to turn it over to my good friend Mike Kapel. Mike's actually a local radio host, morning show host, has been in radio about as long as me, 25, 30 years. He's also a martial artist, so he knows what he's talking about there. And I'm going to turn it over to him and he's going to ask me the questions. Going to be asking a lot of my guests over the next few months and years. So take it away, Mike.
Well, thanks for the opportunity, Brian. I'm looking forward to chatting with you a little bit about this. I know both of us are certainly interested in martial arts, but we've never really actually sat down all these years and had a good discussion about it. So looking forward to it. So the first thing I want to ask you is, what was your first experience with martial arts, and what age did you get into it? How did you find your way into this world?
Well, for me, it was kind of, I grew up a kid of the 80s, and in the late 70s, early 80s, I was actually a big fan of the show Kung Fu and the Kung Fu theater shows, Bruce Lee, Jackie Chan. But me, I was a little kid who got picked on a lot, and I never thought it was something I could do. I never in my life thought that I could do martial arts. So I watched it as a fan and never even thought of looking into it. That all changed on June 19th, 1984. I remember the exact date.
Wow.
Yeah. And you'll know why in a second, because a new movie came out. I grew up a movie buff. I grew up in central Minnesota, not a lot to do other than go to movies and hang out with your friends. And that June, a brand new movie came out called The Karate Kid.
Oh, yes.
Yep. And me and some friends went to that opening night, and it literally changed my life. I mean, people talk about that, and I've had other guests say the same thing about The Karate Kid. But what the key point was for me, not only did I realize, hey, maybe this is something I could do, but the best part was walking out of the movie theater afterwards. There was two gentlemen standing out there handing out these little yellow cards. So me and my friends, of course, grabbed a card, and as we're walking out, we're reading it, and it was a free month of martial arts lessons from a local school, which I didn't even know that we had a local school. Like I said, I never looked into it, never thought it was something I can do, and it was a local Tung Sudo school, and the instructor's name was Bill Nelson. You'll actually hear me interview in a few episodes. He was my first martial arts instructor. He actually taught in a dance school above our local police department. So I went there. I actually remember the first night I didn't know what to wear, so I had a camouflage sweatpants and a camouflage t-shirt. And what's funny about that is that ended up being my nickname for the year or so I trained. He called me Camel, just because that's what I wore to every class until I got my uniform.
Well, as long as he was calling you Camo and not Camel.
Yeah, no, it was Camo, Mr. Camouflage. So yeah, that's how he knew me. He couldn't remember my name at first, so I was Camo. He was like, "Hey, Camo." I was like, "All right, that's me." But so yeah, my first ever experience doing martial arts was the Korean art of Tung Sudo. And like I said, did that for about a year.
So tell me a little bit about that. I'm not familiar.
It's a lot like, it's a sister art to Taekwondo. So if you're familiar with Taekwondo, it's a lot of the same stuff, a lot of the same terminology.
So I do Hapkido.
Correct, which is also Korean.
Any similarities to that?
No, it's definitely a lot closer to Taekwondo.
Okay.
Taekwondo, it's more kicking and punching. Obviously, we did some of the other stuff too, but a lot of that I don't remember. I only did it for a year,
sure.
And the whole reason was unfortunately my parents couldn't afford for me to keep going. So this was in '84. I was about 10 years old when I started. So So I did it till I was about 11 or 12. And after that, I couldn't afford it. Plus, that was the only school in town, so I had no other options. And just kind of went on. For the next few years, I watched martial arts movies. I read magazines. I read books. I started doing a lot of research. And if you remember, like I do very well, the mid to late 80s, there was a martial arts movie boom. Steven Seagal and Jean-Claude Van Damme, and obviously Chuck Norris and people like that.
And it even showed up in like movies like Lethal Weapon and stuff where they might not have been surrounded by it, but you always had the one character like in a cop movie who somehow, he was in Vietnam or something and picked up on some of this stuff, right?
Exactly. And what happened then as I started doing more research, I read a lot of books about martial arts. I read, Tao of Jeet Kune Do and other things like that. And I also started researching these guys who were in the movies. And of course, back then there was no internet. So I spent a lot of time at the library and reading magazines. And back then the guy I really liked a lot in the movies was Van Damme. So I started researching him, and I actually found out that his first style when he started martial arts as a teenager was Shotokan. So I got it, Shotokan, and then another style that I always wanted to learn was American Kenpo. And so I started doing research, and I couldn't find an American Kenpo school anywhere. That's the style I really wanted to learn. I read a lot about Ed Parker and the style he created. And of course, in 1990, the movie The Perfect Weapon came out with Jeff Speakman, and that's when I was like, I have to learn American Kenpo. But there was nothing. I couldn't even find one in Minnesota at the time. But I found a Shotokan school, and I made the determination. I said, when I turn 16, I'll have a car, I'll have a job. I'm going to drive 30 miles 3 times a week to go to Shotokan. And that was the plan. I told my parents, like, as long as you pay for it, we don't care. And so that was the plan. I planned it for a year. I talked to the instructor. I went down and visited a few times, started saving up money. And the day before my 16th birthday, I blew my knee out in high school gym class.
Oh, no.
Yeah.
Wow.
Talk about heartbreaking.
Very heartbreaking for
Yes.
sure. So after recovering from that, what was your next step in the martial arts world? Did you pick it up still in high school, or was it later on?
I did pick it up in high school. It took a year. Initially, the doctor told me that I wouldn't be able to do any martial arts at all, anything physical. He told me I couldn't play basketball, couldn't do tennis, nothing until I had my knee completely rebuilt. So I went to physical therapy back then. Now it's changed, but back then they did not want to do complete reconstructive surgery on someone that young. They wanted to wait till you were stopped growing, where now they'll do it on kids that young. So I was supposed to wait till I was like 20 to 21 before I could do martial arts again. And I basically said, screw you, doc. And I started going to physical therapy and actually working out. I'd never really worked out before. Started lifting weights and doing stuff with my knee. And after about a year, my knee just felt good. I had a knee brace and stuff. So I'm like, I'm not even going to ask the doctor. I'm just going to go. And I went and joined Shotokan.
Wow, nice.
Yeah. So it was the end of my junior year, beginning of my senior year, and ended up doing, Shotokan for a while. Until I left for college, but I took Shotokan from Central Minnesota Karate in St. Cloud, Minnesota. Instructor named Tim Keel, who you'll also hear me do an interview with. I've been lucky to go back and interview most of my former instructors, which has been fun. But the cool thing about Tim Keel, if you Google Central Minnesota Karate, and when I interview him, I'll put a link on, but you got to look at his picture. Chuck Norris's twin brother, swear to God, he looks just like him.
Take a look at that.
That was the first thing I noticed when I walked in there. Oh, this is weird. He looked just like him. But the cool thing about Shotokan's Japanese style, very hard style, very traditional. That was the first style I ever had seen a makiwara board in person. If you're a movie guy, if you remember the Steven Seagal movie Hard to Kill.
Absolutely.
Yeah, when he went into a coma and woke up. Makiwara board, that's the thing he wrapped twine around the board and punched it to strengthen his. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
That's Japanese, and that's the first time I ever saw one actually used in person and in class, and got to use that and stuff. So that was a lot of fun. But that was another fun style, and like I said, I was able to do it until I left for college. But tried to keep in contact with my instructors over the years and keep in touch and stuff. And it was a fun style, fond memories of it. At the time, I had just decided I wanted something different than Tang Soo Do. Nothing against Tang Soo Do. Just I was one kind of going back to like the whole Bruce Lee thing and the Tao of Jeet Kune Do. I had decided early on I wanted to learn many styles. I definitely wanted to find a core style to be my base, but I wanted to train in other styles and learn different things and kind of blend them together into my own thing.
What did it sounds like you had a few different instructors there. So what did you like about the teaching styles, or maybe some things that you didn't like about some of those teaching styles, which gets really weird in martial arts is, as somebody who's really only had one teacher his entire time doing it, I've been in and out for about 15 years, and I've had one one main teacher, and then the other teachers are other students that I practiced with that
Right.
have been more consistent with it. So I've never really kind of gotten outside my bubble. It sounds like you've trained with quite a few different people. So what styles did you feel just for you responded to better in terms of teaching compared to things that maybe were a turnoff for you?
Oh, that's actually a good question. That actually perfectly brings me up to my next thing. Cause like I said, I studied Shotokan until I went to college, and all those first instructors, I didn't have anything to compare it to.
Sure.
They were good instructors, but I had nothing bad to compare it to. But when I started college, that's when I first started Taekwondo, which since then has become my core system, a traditional Taekwondo. Been doing that for almost 30 years, about 28 years now. But my first Taekwondo instructor at first seemed really good, but I started to realize, after about a year and a half or so, that all the person cared about was tournaments and competition and winning. And it literally started to remind me of John Kreese from The Karate Kid. It was
real, very much. This is what we're all about here. This is what we're training for. Yeah, and I think that's. I mean, when you think of martial arts, I think you go in not understanding what it's about, but as you're in it more, you realize that to me anyway, you realize that fighting is kind of one of the last things it's about, in my mind anyway.
Exactly. And a funny thing about that is that when I started Taekwondo, at the same time, I also started Aikido. I found out that at Concordia College in Moorhead, Minnesota, there was a teacher there. He wasn't a black belt. He was a second Q, which was level right before black belt. And he basically taught it wasn't really a class, but it was more of a club or a workout thing. But he taught Aikido just more for himself to keep it going every day, Monday through Friday, 7 a.m. So for about a year, I woke up every morning at 7 a.m. and got my ass thrown around and learned how to fall properly and roll properly. And my Taekwondo instructor at the time found out I was doing another martial art, and he freaked. And I was taking Taekwondo as a credit through college at the time, and he actually threatened to fail me and make me lose a credit because I was studying another style. And I actually had to go to the school and complain about him. But it got to the point where he got so bad where I started hating martial arts. And at one point in early 1994, I actually thought about giving it up completely. It was that bad. He made me hate it that much. I mean, forced me to enter tournaments I didn't want to enter and stuff, because I never got into it for the competition part. It was always about more than that. But luckily, one of the assistants, I remember him, and actually this is kind of cool. I finally, after all these years, tracked him down on Facebook earlier this year. But it was a red belt named Jason St. Michael, who was an assistant. And one day after class, he pulled me aside when we were walking out, and he's like, I can tell something's wrong. I can tell you're not loving this like you used to. And he kind of talked to me and asked me questions. He goes, I think you need to check out this other instructor in town. I think you'll really like him a lot. I think it's what you're looking for. And he recommended it. And the funny part about this was I called the instructor and found out, when his classes were, and decided to go watch one class first just to see. And I still to this day don't know why I stuck around after that first night, because I walked in and watched a class, and I walked in and there was about, I think, 6 or 7 adult students. And half of them were sitting on the ground with their backs against the wall, their legs straight out with their pant legs rolled up from their uniforms. And their partners were kneeling over them with wooden bow staffs, rolling them on their shins. And,
oh my gosh.
Yeah, and they had this look of pain in their face. Yeah. I'm like, oh my God, I'm going to like this? Seriously? It kind of freaked the hell out of me. Luckily,
it's funny you bring that up. I had an experience like that this summer. A friend of mine was teaching a class outside in a park right by where I work, and it was a Taekwondo class. And so I have never taken Taekwondo. Like I said, I've done Hapkido.
Yep.
And Taekwondo has always been interesting to me because it just a little more striking. I mean, Hapkido, you do some striking, but learning some forms and things is always something I thought would be kind of fun. So I was like, I'll walk over and just observe the class, because I'm in my work uniform, and it's 75, 80 degrees summer day.
Yep.
Go over to the park, and they're starting to work on something. Well, then they pull out some nunchucks. And I have never played with those. So I was like, oh, okay. So next thing you know, I'm hopped in line. I'm working on nunchucks in my work clothes. And it was a blast. I had a great time. So I think it's a lot of fun to explore other arts. But you brought something up that some teachers get very territorial if somebody goes and works with another teacher. So I don't know if that's one of the unwritten rules everywhere, if there's just certain instructors like that. What's your experience been with that? Are some more open to that than others?
Oh yeah, definitely more. Some are more. What's funny is these 2 instructors that I had both trained with the same instructor.
Okay.
And the instructor I switched to, which is still my current instructor since 1994, told me that their instructor, their grandmaster Mu Young Yun, who's now a 10th degree black belt, encouraged them to train in other styles and told them, you can't just do this one thing, and encourage them to cross train and learn new things. And our, the Taekwondo school I currently train at, we were as far as I know, we were one of the first schools in our area in the early to mid 90s to start blending in groundwork and start doing jujitsu and grappling and stuff like that, which a lot of other schools, it was unheard of at the time. And UFC was just coming out and everything. And so it was kind of different, but it was, that's the school I've been with ever since. And obviously I've continued my exploration. In 1996, I actually finally followed my dream and moved to California just to train in American Kempo.
Wow.
And actually specifically moved there to train with Jeff Speakman from the movie Perfect Weapon. And by the time I got there, he had moved his school. I had already had a job lined up, place to live. But I did end up, I did get to train with him a few times. One of his students still ran that school. And I also got to train with Larry Tatum, who's probably one of at this point, the world's expert on American Kempo. He was one of the top students of the guy who founded the style, Ed Parker, who unfortunately passed away many, many years ago. But yeah, I loved the style. I loved living out there. I loved training in it. But unfortunately, due to personal reasons, I didn't get to stay out there. Had a fiance at the time who did not want to live in California, hated California, and pretty much gave me that ultimatum. So
yeah,
I came
California is one of those places you love it or you hate it, right? There's no in between.
Exactly. Yeah. And that was the last time I really did in-depth cross training. Since then I've done a lot, little here and there. It's just been, obviously after that, had kids and whatnot, got a lot busier life. Yeah. But I mean, even since then, I did some training in Hapkido, did training in Judo, and actually when I was younger, I did a little boxing too. I forgot to mention that. I was lucky enough in my hometown to have a Olympic boxer who some people may have heard of, named Dwayne Bobbick. Actually graduated high school with his sister, but he fought in the Olympics. He sparred Muhammad Ali, fought Ken Norton. But yeah, it was, so I did a little bit of boxing and even about 15 years ago now, I trained in boxing for a while with Jim Erickson, good friend of mine. He used to run the North Dakota Athletic Commission, and he's actually was one of Virgil Hill's first trainers.
Okay.
And so I met him through, I used to judge MMA, which we can chat about a little later too, but sure. I met Jim through that, and we were kind of joking around one time, and I mentioned, hey, boxers don't know how to kick, and he's like, well, you teach me to kick, I'll teach you to punch. So for about 6 months, we got together every morning at 5 a.m. at our Taekwondo school, and I worked on kicking with him, and he worked on punching with me, and it was a blast.
Yeah, it's great to learn from other people too. You talk about instructors, but just other students and people that have very practiced, not only like you said in martial arts, but things like boxing and other things that you can bring in to the fold, and it can help you in a lot of different ways for sure. So let's back up. You talked about going as a child. A lot of kids, like you said, growing up our age. Mm-hmm. In the 80s, saw things like Karate Kid. And look, even now, right? I think about how many kids are watching Cobra Kai and are probably thinking about getting into martial arts. Parents are watching it. So what would you say to parents looking to get their kids into martial arts these days, or maybe a youngster listening to this, a preteen or a teenager who's thinking about it?
I'll tell you, I honestly get asked this question at least once or twice a week, just because people know I'm involved in martial arts. Whether it's coworkers or friends, I'll get emails, I'll get texts, hey, I'm thinking of putting my kid in this. Hey, I'm thinking of doing this. So first thing I do, well, first of all, it depends on if they're local, it's a different thing. If they're in an area I don't know, I'll go and do the research for them. I'll go and research and say, hey, I found 7 martial arts schools in your area. Here's they are. But I tell people, I said, go watch as many classes as you can. I said, if there's area we're in, there's roughly 35 martial arts classes in about a 25-mile radius of here. And I'll tell people, I said, you go to at least pick out 5 to 10 and go watch at least one class in every one. Watch the instructor, see how they interact with students, see how they interact with adults, see how they interact with kids, have a conversation with them. Big thing I tell is, make sure they have some kind of introductory course. If they're not willing to let you try at least a class or two for free, I would not even consider it personally. Some will give free 2 weeks, some will give a free month. And the other thing I really warn against is contracts. Don't get stuck in some kind of long-term contract. You don't want to put your kid in something and 3 months later they decide they don't want to do it anymore and you're stuck for a year. So you need to make sure that it's something they're gonna want to do and enjoy and want to go to. But I personally think it's something that I think everyone should do at some point in their life. I'd love it to be part of the school curriculum, and I actually tried that years ago with Ben Franklin Junior High, and actually had a conversation. I had the vice principal on board, but could not get the school board to agree to it. I was going to teach a martial arts class there, and they, some were very into it, but enough weren't. They're worried about insurance and liability and all stuff like that. But there was back in the 80s, Chuck Norris actually did that in Texas and got it into a lot of schools, and it proven success. I mean, gang involvement was down, drug involvement was down, graduation rates were up, grades were up, it just positive across the board, and it was mandatory from like 6th through 8th grade, and it was a huge success. And unfortunately,
you think of all the elements that it brings in, right?
Yep.
That are issues, and not only physical exercise being the component of it, that's a big part of it, which kids definitely need, but there's a discipline angle to it that I think is missing for a lot of kids. And then there's, as you get into it, you go in again. I mean, you start and think, okay, gee, I want to be a black belt someday, right? I think that's all of our thoughts when we first get into a martial art. And as you start that journey down the road, you realize the black belt is just another step along the way. It's not a destination. I mean, I think for me, that was the biggest thing. And I didn't start till I was over 30 years old before I stepped into a martial arts school and started. And so again, you go in thinking, oh, okay. I mean, you get the stuff initially and you're talking, it's like, well, how long do you think till I get a black belt? And they all kind of chuckle and say, well, we'll worry about that later. And you're kind of thinking, well, what's the deal here? And as you start to go down that road, Brian, you really do realize, the black belt is just, it's something you work towards, obviously, but it's not really, when you start, you think the black belt is the end. And as you get into it, you realize the black belt's really only the beginning.
Exactly. And that's another thing, from your previous question, is that's one thing I'll ask is if you go to a school and they say you'll have your black belt within 3 years, walk away. Any place that guarantees you'll have a black belt, there's schools that actually will sign a black belt contract that says in 18 months you will have your black belt no matter what.
That's what I loved about my teacher, and to this day still, because he always talked about, he goes, if somebody walks into our school and says, how long till I get a black belt? Because the standard is, it's about 3 years with the school I went to. They figured if you kind of went along the journey and got your belt around the time. And then he always told the story. He goes, then some students say, well, what if I really, really put some time in and really worked hard? Then he would say, well, then it's going to take you 4 years. And then they'd say, well, what if I really, 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 really train? He goes, it's going to take you 5 years. Because it's not about that. And that's kind of for me when I started to realize, I think I'm in a good school. I think I'm in a good place. This isn't a belt mill.
Right. Yeah. The nickname out there is the McDojo, fast food dojos. And it's
and I understand that, look, I get it. It's a business, right? And you have to have those ways to get your income. So I don't knock a school for doing that. But when I heard my teacher talking like that, once I had been around long enough to kind of get the gist of how things work, I was like, yeah, this is a good place to be. Yeah. Good mindset to have.
And I will knock schools like that.
Well, that's
no problem doing
up
that.
To you. I'm not knocking anybody trying to make a living, but there are some, it's like, I do hear about some friends, like you said, that have kids, and it's like, yeah, my son tested for his brown with orange blue. I'm like, what?
Yep. Yeah. And that's the other thing to watch for too, is when it comes to teaching kids, the one thing I watch for is, do they differentiate between kids and adults? Because giving a 9-year-old a black belt and considering them the same rank as a 20-year-old black belt, in my personal opinion, is very wrong. And I've seen that at Taekwondo schools, and
dangerous.
That's my school has junior black belts. You can't get an adult black belt till you're a certain age. It's I believe in that. And there's some styles who just won't teach kids. You can't even start until you're 15 or 16.
That's like Hapkido is exactly like that, because of there's so much focus on joint locks and things like that we won't even generally take students till they're mid to late teens.
And that's fine. That's fine. The ones that there's also ones that'll take them as young as 3, which I think is crazy. But you got to look at what the style is and what they're trying to accomplish. If it's strictly a sport, martial arts, and they're doing just like gymnastics, they'll start kids when they're 2-3 years old. They're basically doing somersaults for a year. It's I'm guessing most martial arts schools aren't going to have 3-year-olds breaking boards and stuff. I would hope not. But our school, we do weapons training. We'll even do weapons training for kids that young, 5-6-year-olds. But they're using padded nunchucks, they're using padded swords, and teaching them the very basic stuff. We're not giving them.
Don't call me your sister with this type of stuff, right?
And that's one thing that's still to this day why all my kids went to the same school I did, is because the instructor is the way he is with kids. I mean, he's an amazing instructor, but just the way he is with kids. kids, which I didn't notice at first because I was, 20 years old when I started with him. And then I started helping with kids classes and seeing how he was. And one cool thing that he's done for decades is that when it comes time to test for your belt, he'll actually send a permission slip home for your parents that they have to sign it, and they have to check 2 boxes, and they have to say, my child has been respectful at home, yes or no, and my child has been doing well in school, yes or no. If either one is no, you don't test for your belt.
Right.
And parents love that.
Yeah. And I know that teacher you're talking about,
Yep.
he is fantastic.
Exactly.
I've seen some of the demos he's done with kids and stuff. I've never been to an actual class, but I've seen enough demos and things where he does a great job. And you can tell the kids really love him, and there's a mutual respect there, which is another question I want to ask you actually is, that's the kind of stuff you mentioned. It takes you into everyday life. You talk about these kids with discipline and stuff at home, very basic kind of things, but what about as an adult? So, obviously you've been around martial arts for a long time, and I would imagine you take some of those things that you've picked up, not only from when you were younger, but even your training as an adult, and take those into your everyday life. How do you use it as an adult who has a job and kids and all those things?
There's many for me, but the one that sticks out right away that I think that it was another life-changing thing. And so when I first started in martial arts, when I was a kid, even through my first few years of college, I was very shy. And me, you probably won't believe this. I mean, I was probably the shyest kid in school.
I would not believe that.
Yeah. I would not get up and I would not get up. Yeah. I would not get up in front of people and do book reports. I actually, in 10th grade, we had to take a mandatory speech class. And we were supposed to get up like once a week and do a speech. I skipped every single one. And until the final week, she pulled me aside. She's like, this is a required class. If you don't do your final speech, you're failing and you will not graduate. So it was supposed to be a 15-minute speech on the subject of my choice. So that night I was just stressed. I mean, I was sweating, just terrified to get up there. So the day comes, I was the last one she called on. And I walked up there, didn't make eye contact with anybody, and pulled this crinkled up piece of paper out of my pocket, read it word for word, and sat down covered in sweat. I was up there like 45 seconds for my 15-minute speech.
3 hours, I bet.
Exactly. And after class, she pulled me aside. She's like, I'm giving you a D-. Don't ever set foot in here again. But the best part about that is that, in 94, 95, when I started with my current instructor, with Jim Grimstead, he pushed me out of my comfort zone. He started, first of all, having me help teach class, which I had never thought of doing before. And suddenly I think I was a purple belt. I think it was. He pulled me aside one day and he's like, so I'm going to give you your own class. I'm like, okay, yes, sir. I guess so, and he's like, be here on this day and this time. And I remember showing up and I get there and there's all these people out on the floor that are higher ranks than me. I'm like, oh, it must be an advanced class. I need to wait till they're done. And he's comes walking out of the dressing room. He's like, oh, your class is out there. Go teach. I'm like, sir, every one of those people outranks me. He goes like, doesn't matter. It's your class. He goes, they don't listen. Give them push-ups. He goes, Mr. Bryan's in charge. And he walked out the door. And I'm like, oh my God. It's like, talk about baptism by fire. But he pushed me out of me. He saw something in me and it pushed out of my comfort zone. And I did it. And it got easier and easier and easier. And the cool part about that, and I wish I actually tried to track down this, high school speech teacher, and I haven't had any luck yet, but because of that, and obviously with working in radio, you get asked to like MC events and stuff.
Yep.
I remember the first time I got asked to do that, I think it was 98 or 99. And I did it. The radio station made me do it, and I was terrified, but I got through it. It was definitely a lot easier, than I thought it was going to be, but I was still shaking, covered in sweat, and I kept doing it, and it got easier and easier. And, at this point I've been on stage in front of 5,000 people without blinking. Doesn't faze me in the least. And I owe it all to my instructor forcing me to teach that class back in like 1995. It changed that much. And like I said, I've done, corporate trainings for people. I've announced MMA fights. I've been the guy with the mic in the cage in front of 5,000 people in the Shield Center, announcing fights, and it doesn't faze me anymore because of that. So that's, for me, that's probably the biggest part. I mean, obviously, we have the tenets of Taekwondo, courtesy, integrity, perseverance, self-control, indomitable spirit. Those are things that, are obviously important, but as far as impact, changing my life, I would have never started announcing sports if it wasn't for that. I would have never got up and done, training sessions that I do professional voiceover, as do you. And I've got up and done training sessions at voiceover conferences for people and stuff. And none of that would have ever happened if it wasn't for him forcing me to teach that class that many years ago.
So let's switch gears. We talked about this a little earlier too, is MMA and UFC. These are things. So again, growing up when we did, it was boxing, right? That was the whole thing. In fact, when we grew up in the 80s, it was the heyday of those middleweights, like your your Sugar Ray Leonards, your Thomas Hearns, Virgil Hill you brought up,
Yep.
Marvin Hagler, and then of course Mike Tyson came along, and then there was that whole thing, and boxing was king. And then in the 90s, this no rules fighting came along, and then it sort of morphed into UFC and MMA, and now we've seen just this massive explosion where boxing, because I think largely just a lack of organization in general. There was no real main governing body. I think that's what mixed martial arts has done correctly with UFC. In a lot of ways, has just blown up in its popularity. Everybody loves it, and it has taken to it. I've been a little slower on that, just again growing up around boxing. I have gained an appreciation for UFC and MMA just because of being involved in it like I have been. But again, I didn't do that until I was in my mid 30s, so about 15 years ago. But it's been a slower turn for me. So I don't have a lot of experience with it. I watch it a little bit, but what are your general thoughts on UFC, MMA, and where that whole world has come from and where it's going?
I admit I was a fan almost from day one. I don't think I watched UFC 1, but I watched UFC 2 live.
So you go way back.
Yeah. A friend of mine, I think it was 94. And actually in another future episode, you'll hear me interview someone who competed in UFC number 2. So
wow.
Fun to chat with him. Maybe that was a fun interview. Looking forward to playing.
Like I said,
one.
I don't follow. What are they on UFC? Like, what did I hear? 250 or something the other day?
And that's the funny part is
I don't even know where it's at.
Yeah. I kind of quit watching it. I mean, it's what's funny is it was such a massive part of my life. Like I said, I got into it at a young age, and we went to some local fights that happened. Obviously it was so different back in the 90s. There's almost no rules. I mean, the first for UFC is the only rules were no biting, no eye gouging, no fish hooking. Anything else went. I remember one of the like UFC 3 or 4 where a guy took like 15 consecutive groin shots, and it was perfectly legal back then. Yeah, I know, and did not tap out. So
I think maybe that was the turn off for me early on. And it's not that anymore.
Yeah,
but early on, I was just like, wow, this is too much for me. Again, as a boxing fan, which I guess is a gladiator sport, but there was kind of a gentlemanly quality to it as well, right, with the rules and things. So I don't know, it's a weird mixture, but yeah, it's certainly changed since then.
And when it started, like I said, it started changing. The original owners, they were doing well, but not great, so they had to sell it. And when the Zuffa brothers or whatever bought it, and Dana White got involved, and it kind of exploded. I got a little more involved, and I got lucky. One of the black belts at the school I trained at became a fight promoter and needed people to get trained how to like judge and how to ref and announce and all that stuff. So I started judging just because I wanted to get into the fights. I wanted to go to these fights, but I didn't want to pay to go to them. So I figured if I was if I was a judge, I'd be the best seats in the house. But
and being in the ring, right?
Exactly. I had no interest in that. I've trained people for that, but I've had no interest in doing it myself.
I tell you what, until I got into martial arts, I always wondered. You watch boxing, and it's generally a 3-minute round or whatever. Some sports or lower levels or different amateur bouts, they'll do maybe shorter ring rounds or whatever. And until you've sparred, you don't realize how long 2 or 3 minutes is. And then to do it round after round after, I can't imagine the training that these guys need to do that. Just as somebody who's sparred on a very limited level, it's 2 minutes, just like you're talking about that speech for 45 seconds, 2 minutes can seem like a half hour.
Oh, and that's one reason, just not just in Taekwondo, but even like some MMA fighters we've trained at our school. If it's a 3-minute round you're training for, we don't train for 3 minutes. We train 5-minute rounds because we don't want to be tired when it gets to the end of the 3 minutes. So if you're going to have to do, 5 3-minute rounds, we're going to train 5 5-minute rounds, it's to make that work. But as I said, so I started judging this stuff back in, God, when was the first one I judged? 2003 or 2004, and judged for over a decade. I judged over 1,000 pro fights in Minnesota, North Dakota, South Dakota. Judged some big names, that have, come through the area and stuff. And then I started, towards the end of the judging, I started announcing just for fun. I never wanted to announce initially because as a judge, you can judge like any event, and most announcers are attached to one specific one. I figured if I was a judge, I could go to all the fights. If I was an announcer, I'd only go to those. So I started announcing, and I announced about a dozen fights and stuff. But it's after I quit doing that, it kind of, not me personally, but I saw a couple really close calls. It not really that I lost my taste for it, but I saw 1 or 2 people almost die in the cage, and I was very close to that happening. I saw some really bad injuries, and it just, if it's on, I'll watch it, but I don't go out of my way to watch it like I used to. I used to never miss a UFC. I'd watch all the Pride events. I'd watch all the Bellator. And it just, plus just time and busyness and, and doing other things and, podcasting and all that stuff, everything kind of get in the way. But if it's on, I'll watch it and I still enjoy it. It's kind of a guilty pleasure type thing, but,
Sure. Well, it's hard not to appreciate the sport of it, right? When
exactly.
you're on this side of it and you've done these things and you've trained in these classes, and sometimes that's what bothers me about it is I know there's a lot of great fans out there, but I sometimes don't think they truly understand what these guys in that ring go through to get to that point, the training
Yeah.
and what's involved in that.
Oh, the training's crazy. Like I said, I've only helped train a handful of fighters. I mean, we're not an MMA gym, but if someone comes to us and wants to do it, we'll train. We have the tools to do it, and I've trained some people, and it's intense. I mean, but you go to some of the actual MMA schools in town too, and it's even more intense when those guys take it very seriously. And we're lucky. We have, our local MMA schools in this area have had success. They've sent a lot of people to the UFC, and I'll be interviewing actually Dylan Spicer on a future episode. He runs the Fargo Academy of Combat Arts, and he's like Pablo Garza and Tim Johnson, and he's Dane Sayers. He's at a lot of fighters that have made it big names for themselves, and he runs a tight ship over there. It's fun to watch. I know one thing I was lucky enough to see one time, one of the training they do is they get, the guy who's fighting gets in the middle, who has a fight coming up, and everyone surrounds him in a circle. And it's like, I can't remember if it's every 30 seconds or every minute. He gets a new opponent, so he doesn't get a break. And I think if I remember, it's like every other one, it's either stand on your feet or on the ground. So it's like you're down for 30 seconds, up for 30 seconds, down, and it's a new opponent. So they're always fresh, and you keep going till you go through everybody. It's intense.
That's the only way you learn, though. I can tell you the one night I'll never forget as my instructor, I showed up for class. It was a Friday in the summer. And so guess what? Nobody else showed up for class. And it was in a gym that we had no air conditioning in this gym. And my instructor is about to leave to go back down south where he's from to his school. And they did a couple of hop keto events each year. I think they still do, like one in the winter, like February, and one's in August. Okay. And so this is August, and I'm a yellow belt or like a green belt. I mean, I'm just into this. And he looks at me, and this guy's been doing it as long as I've been alive. I'm 47 years old. And he looks at me and says, well, he goes, I have to do a demo down in Jackson. And I guess I'm going to work on you with that. And this guy threw me around this gym for 45 minutes straight. But it was one of those nights where I think I learned more than combined in one night than I learned in many nights, just because I had to learn how to fall and just get a true feel for a lot of these techniques he was doing to me. I didn't have a choice.
And I think 3 or 4 times over the years, I've had that happen where I've showed up for an adult class and I was the only one. And I was like, the first time it scared me, then I was like, ooh, free private lesson.
Yeah, you learn quickly. You definitely, when somebody's doing techniques at a elite level, a master level, and throwing you around, not only do you learn to fall and get out of those techniques in terms of your safety properly, but you learn what they feel like when done correctly.
And I think because of that experience myself, I've always been one where if I see a student needs extra help or wants extra practice before a test, I'll be one of the first ones to volunteer. Hey, I'll go in with them on a weekend. I'll go in on a Saturday and work with them for 2 hours so they can pass their test. I have no problem doing that. And, I've never expected anything for it. It's just, I enjoy it. For one thing, it helps me as much as it helps them. That's one thing I've learned over the years as a black belt is I definitely learned the techniques better after teaching them than just learning them. So it's a huge difference.
For me, it was having them done to me. That helps me a lot. It's like, oh, okay, I because you feel like what it's supposed to be.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you about a favorite martial artist or somebody you look up to. I mean, I think you talked about some movie guys and stuff, but do you have any practitioners in particular that you try to pattern yourself after, or just look up to, or just some general thoughts on that?
There's a few. Obviously, the first one that comes to mind is Bruce Lee. I mean, that's easily, like I said, it's a whole philosophy on combining styles and using what works and taking away. That's just something I've always kind of believed in, and kind of what I think kind of helps set my way through martial arts and stuff. That's something I've always appreciated. Another one I looked up to, never got to meet either, was Ed Parker, another one who died, way before his time. The guy who created American Kempo. It was just someone I looked up to. But as far as people I've known and people I've met, I mean, my current instructor, Master Jim Grimstead. Just I've stuck with him since '94. Obviously, there's it's not a mistake. I've been with him that long. It's just the way he conducts himself, the way he teaches, the way he shows the martial arts. It's someone I've always looked up to. He's definitely a friend, but he's an amazing instructor, and I'll train with him as long as I'm able to, for sure.
How about before we wrap up here, books, movies? I know you talked about some of your influences, but what are some of those things that really stand out to you as some of those top influences in terms of a book or a TV show or a movie?
I think the first one, two that I can think of that are probably my favorite as far as books is Tao Jeet Kune Do by Bruce Lee. Obviously, is a phenomenal book. And then Zen in the Martial Arts by Joe Hyams. I think anyone who's involved in martial arts should read that book. It's a small paperback. It's a quick read. It's more about like the philosophy side of things. And it's one that I have, and I'll read it every couple of years. I'll dig it out and read it. And it's just a fun one. As far as movies and TV shows, obviously I talked about The Karate Kid. That kind of started my whole path. I mean, that was I'm a huge movie buff. Any movie that has to do with martial arts, I'll give it a shot. I mean, obviously there's some bad ones out there, and I'll never watch them again, but that one definitely stands on the top of the list. TV shows, there was a great one when I was a kid, and this was right around the time of The Karate Kid. I think it was a little before that. There was a show called Sidekicks. A lot of people don't remember it. It was actually I think it was produced by Disney, but it was spun off of a movie called The Last Electric Night. But at the time was starring a very young Ernie Reyes Jr., who at the time was, I believe, I want to say he was like 9 or 10 when he made the TV show, but he was a little kid, and he was in it with Gil Gerard and Buck Rogers himself. And Gil Gerard played a cop, and he was kind of raising this kid, and they basically go and fight crime together. So he had this little 10-year-old kid who already at that age was an amazing martial artist. I mean, his dad, Ernie Reyes Sr., was world renowned, and so he started training when he was like 3 years old. And that's another interview I'm looking forward to. Again, kind of giving a hint. I got the okay to interview Ernie Reyes Jr., so I'm excited about that one. And then obviously you mentioned earlier Cobra Kai. I mean,
yeah,
dude,
really good, isn't it? I was shocked. When it first came out on YouTube Red, which is a thing that doesn't exist anymore, I was like, okay, I got to see this thing. And I watched the first season. I was telling everybody about it. I'm like, it's actually really good. And they're like, well, how can that be good? And then fast forward about a year and a half later, it hits Netflix and has blown up ever since. And it's the biggest deal going, but it's very well done. I think it does martial arts a great service in kind of showing some right and some wrong and how you should and shouldn't do things. And certainly piques the interest, right?
Oh yeah, and I feel kind of bad now thinking about it. We're recording this over Christmas break, and this episode won't air until probably sometime in January. We probably should have waited till season 3 came out. We could have talked about it.
Well, let's plan to talk again, and we'll just talk about specifically Cobra Kai. That can be a podcast, right?
We might have to do that. I'm excited. This Friday, man, I don't work, and I'm going to watch the whole season. So I'm excited.
The beauty of podcasting. We can do about whatever we want.
That is true. No, it's any of those shows. There's a lot of the ones I've enjoyed though. I've been like Sidekicks are unknown. There was a show in the early 90s called Street Justice that starred Carl Weathers. Everyone remembers him. Apollo Creed. Yep. It was kind of like Sidekicks with adults, but he was a cop, and there was this young orphan kid who he knew when he was younger that grew up, and as an adult, the actor's name was Brian Genesee, who was a black belt in Hung Gar Kung Fu, I believe. But he would go, Carl Weathers was a cop, and Brian Genesee would go and fight crime with him. So kind of the same thing with adults type thing. But shows like that. There's the one-off shows that last a couple seasons. There was a show in the early 80s called The Master, starring Lee Van Cleef and Timothy Van Patten. And Lee Van Cleef was a ninja. Wow. You go back and watch it now, it's so cheesy, but he was a ninja, traveling, through America, and he took this kid under his wings. I have the first few episodes on DVD, and Demi Moore's in the pilot episode.
What's that one called?
It's called The Master. The
Master.
Yes. Yeah.
Well, you've definitely demonstrated a deep knowledge of television shows of the 80s, Brian. No doubt about that. And certainly a deep passion for martial arts and a great history with martial arts, and definitely looking forward to your podcast and all the great interviews you have lined up. And I really appreciate you asking me to do this interview with you. And it's been a lot of fun to walk through this memory lane with you a little bit about martial arts, talk about your philosophies on it, and give people a chance to see what you're about as you head into this new venture with the podcast. And I want to wish you best of luck with the podcast. Sounds like you got a lot of great stuff lined up for it.
Oh yeah, I'm thank you for agreeing to do this. And this is a long time coming. I initially had this thought back in 1997, a radio station I was working at. I pitched the idea of a martial arts talk show, and they no way wouldn't work. Fast forward 10 years later, I was working at actually a station you're very familiar with, an AM station in town. Same thing, but this was even better. I pitched them the idea. I had all these stats, and like there was 35 martial arts schools in town. I had 3 sponsors lined up for it already, and they still said no. Had money willing to come in, they still said no. And there's around 3 years ago, I started thinking about the podcast. I had some ideas and ran some different names and reaching out to people about doing some interviews. And it was the pandemic that kind of launched it. I'm like, I have a little extra free time, and I think I'm going to finally do this, and actually started recording some of these interviews over the summer and been building them up and to get ready to launch. And I'm hoping people enjoy it as much as I've enjoyed doing the interviews, and I'm looking forward to people hearing it. And I'm sure a lot of people will skip this first episode that won't care about me. They'll go to the fun stuff. And the cool thing about it is I've tried to make it a mixture of, some well-known people and some people you've never heard of. Like I said, a lot of my former instructors, your instructor, had a nice interview with Master Hillen, some known people. Ed Parker Jr. That actually might end up being, I haven't finished editing yet, but I think that'll end up being a 2-part interview. We talked for almost 90 minutes. It was such a great interview. To give a few teasers of upcoming episodes, James DeMille, who I just interviewed a couple days ago, was one of Bruce Lee's original students in Seattle in 1959. Another phenomenal interview. Brock Larson, who's fought in the UFC, the WEC, and I give him the title, the nicest guy in MMA, one of the nicest guys I've ever met. Another great interview. So I think it'll be a lot of fun. And I got some other ones lined up that are coming up, over the next, few weeks I'll be doing and getting the show ready for launch. But I said, it's been fun. It's been a passion, and I hope people will enjoy it.
Best of luck.
Thank you, sir. Thanks for listening to Everyday Martial Artist. We hope you will join us every week for a brand new episode with a different martial artist telling their story. If you enjoy the show, be sure to leave us a review. Also, be sure to check out our website at everydaymartialartist.com. There you can find all of our episodes and contact us to suggest guests and ask questions. Again, thanks for listening to Everyday Martial Artist, and we'll see you next week.